This pyramid that you saw behind me, and here it is in a larger scope and larger image, is actually the bent pyramid in Saqqara. And the bent pyramid is a really interesting place to start because it's, not talked about that often. And when people point to the bent pyramid, the archaeological story is that it was an accident that they started building this structure and then, oops, that angle's too sharp. Let's change the angle and then we'll finish the pyramid. This really gives a good illustration of the kinds of guesses and postulations made by a lot of the largest archaeologists in the world, not even necessarily by their own fault, but by the actions of earlier archaeologists who mostly came out of like the British Empire, came and looked at these sites and they did their best to explain how the heck this thing was built and what it was and why it was. But when we start to actually look at the structure of the bent pyramid, and these are some diagrams by my good friend Alan Green, you realize that the lower portion of the pyramid is actually exactly the geometry that creates the equilateral triangle inside of the hexagram or the flower of life. And the upper pyramid triangle is exactly the triangle it takes to make the pentagram. And for those of you that aren't really that familiar with geometry, if you've ever heard me talk, you probably deep into it at this point, or Nassim Aramain or many of my other colleagues. But essentially, getting to know this dynamic of the 5-6 is critical to understanding all of reality. It's actually, in some ways, kind of the key codex of reality, in which all mass, gravity, curvature, and the properties of what make up a physical body and being, all the way down to the phi ratio, essentially forming that curve that your fingers make and the proportions in your body, and down to your DNA actually being at that geometric ratio from the length to the width of one turn of your DNA. And then, of course, the 6 connects us to electromagnetism, equilibrium, Buckminster Fuller's tensegrity, and so on and so forth. And so we know in this ancient site, just by looking at its geometry at the largest level, that there's this incredible level of depth to that, an unbelievably beautiful level of coherent knowledge inside of that. And that knowledge goes deeper and deeper. I reference Alan Green's work because he is an absolute genius, and I highly recommend looking at his work on Shakespeare and the Great Pyramid of Giza, because understanding the key mathematical and geometric codes inside of these structures is truly crucial to better understanding the level of advancement that existed in some of these sites. I'm going to take you on a little bit of a tour to some of the places that have been most impactful for me in my journeys around the world. And those include the Serapeum in Egypt, Ollantaytambo in Peru, and Tiwanaku in Bolivia. We're going to start out our adventure down here in the heart of Peru. And in Peru, there's a particular location that's, again, by standard archaeologically, means known as, an Incan site. And this Incan site has some very interesting particular features. One of them is this wall. Now, if you look at this wall, you can see, as I've got this shot on one of the angles of one of these stones, just how thick this stone is. And the span of it across the front is probably about 8 to 9 feet. And it's another 7 to 8 feet deep. So the stone is, something that we would estimate weighs in the realm of 150 tons, possibly as much as 200 tons. And every one of the stones along this wall is approximately that size. And if you understand how heavy that is, you can kind of get a picture here in your head of placing one of these stones on the back of a semi-truck trailer bed and watching it actually just completely crush that trailer bed. Now, it's possible at some limit close to here that we're at the point where we actually start to crush something even like a locomotive train's axles. So insanely heavy. And we have to ask ourselves, where does this stone come from and how did they put it into this position? Well, it turns out that stone is from a quarry on the very top, in fact, the other side of the peak of this mountain that is across this steep mountained valley of the Andes. Now, the story goes that a king of the Inca back in the day was trying to prove his might to the gods and decided that he was going to go and bring down one of the stones from this quarry, which tells us that this structure was already here, the quarry was already there, and the Incan king wanted to prove himself to some gods or goddesses that he was strong enough. So he gets 100 and something guys and all of these soldiers, these army that is going to essentially pull this stone and bring it down to the mountain. And this went absolutely horribly, as you can imagine. They started to bring the stone down the mountain. The stone began to move out of control because of the force of gravity, and it killed like 150 guys. And the Incan king failed at meeting the standards of his gods through doing this. So we ask, who were these gods? And we look at these structures and we say, all right, well, how did these actually get designed? Who actually built them if it wasn't the Incas? One of the things you notice with the stones at Ollantaytambo is that they have these chacuna-like designs on the front of, chacana-like designs on the front of these large stones, but they're not carved out of the giant stone. They're actually done in relief, where the pattern is coming off of the surface of the stone. You look at the lines of the stones, the way the stones are fitting together, it looks literally like they melted the rock and just pressed it together like it was a soft piece of clay, for example. But this is intensely heavy granite. A lot of these stones have been somehow compacted by massive amounts of pressure, usually inside of the earth. So you don't just get a fluffy, concrete-like structure, pour a bunch of shapes, as some people have assumed must be the case. They must have liquefied the stone and poured it in these shapes. You can't do that with any concrete-like object and end up with this kind of granite. This kind of granite has to be forged in a much, much heavier pressure zone. So we know that there is an advanced technology at play here, and you can see it in the cuts between the stones. It's laser sharp, and you end up with walls like this one seen here that have all of these different little ports in the walls. Now you can see a couple people leaning their heads. Those are a couple of my students leaning their heads into those walls. This was on a Resonance Science Foundation adventure with the Resonance Academy, where I co-teach with others on that trip, including Nassim Haramein and many other amazing teachers and researchers. And as these individuals put your heads into these holes in the walls, what happens is each one has a particular vibratory frequency. And when you vibrate all of the holes together, the entire wall hums, the entire wall sings. This shows us that there is a deeper technological purpose for some of these designs and structures. Now, when we look at places like Sacsayhuaman, we get a little bit different sense of the scale of the kinds of things they were able to construct. Here you have one corner of the wall in Sacsayhuaman, and you can see relative to someone's height just how big they are. Here's another shot, and that stone that's directly behind the two people walking up to it, that's probably a 200-ton stone right there. And as you can see, every stone is a different size, every stone is a different shape, and yet they're fitted together as if they were designed that way, or that somebody carved the entire stones to fit this way. But it just doesn't make sense that you would build things in this manner unless somehow doing this was extraordinarily easy. And why do we think it was easy for them to do this? Well, because there's not really any major purpose for this wall that we can ascertain that's critical to survival. I mean, you would normally put that level of effort into it if you were using this as a way to survive. But this is just the lower wall of a temple structure that goes up a few layers. Here you can see it from a distance. And it's not defensive. It's not agricultural. There's no real particular reason that we understand that this wall was developed or what it was designed to do. And what it is a massive, massive structure with wave after wave after wave after wave after wave giving us a sense that this was something that was easy to do and natural to do in some kind of way for the culture that actually built that wall, which I propose was not the Incas. And we'll go deeper into that, of course. So we also have places where historians say, here's terraces for farming. Okay, well, does that really make sense? Why would we build this beautiful circular structure just to grow our food in? And of course, when you go to the place like Moray Ruins here, you go down into that center circle down at the bottom and you make a sound and you realize it's like an incredible amphitheater. Again, pointing us to a deeper use for these kinds of technologies, a use for these spaces that may have more to do with cymatics, may have more to do with sound resonance, and opening sort of an insight to us that maybe there was a way that the technology and culture of this particular people that were building these kinds of spaces was connected to a higher level of use of vibrational waves to accomplish certain specific energetic goals. That's my initial proposal. And now let's talk about how do we actually prove that? Well, one of the interesting things we can look at as an overlap with that kind of advanced science that may be from an ancient technology is, of course, the Ark of the Covenant. When people talk about what was inside this box, several legends and histories point to something like a black sunstone, a power stone of some kind, something that had the ability to vibrate through walls, to change the structure of things, and to be able to control energy at a vast and extraordinarily powerful level. Now, I point out this with the Ark in particular because there are some sites in Peru that look like they had some sort of extraordinarily powerful object of energy in the middle of the site, and something went wrong. So here at Pisac, if you look at this temple structure, and this is sort of the very, very special sort of secret temple that's further along the ridge that most people don't even ever walk to. And you'll notice looking here at this image, you can see the way that the stones are placed and built together. Perfect in almost all of these structures. And then along the edges, you see some of the Incan construction where it's just stones piled on top of each other. Very, very simple mechanism of construction that the Incas used in many places. While you're looking at this, I also want to point to those lines on the mountains in the background. You see those lines going up near the tops of the mountains? We're going to come back to that in a minute. But first, let's zoom in here and let's take a look at the really interesting thing about this site. In the middle of one of these structures, the central temple structure, which is rounded, is an area of rock that has been melted down to igneous rock. It looks as though whatever was inside of there melted down completely and poured out of this structure as lava. Now, this is not an active volcano. This thing does not have volcanic energy at all. So what was powerful enough to initiate the process of rock inside of this temple melting, turning into magma, and melting out of the structure? I'll show you in this video here that there's always these relationships between water flows, the vibration of water falling and dropping, and some of these really incredible sites. And here you can see the lava flow that has come out of the middle of this temple structure and simply flowed out over the rocks and down. So what melted the rock? What was powerful enough to do something like that? Well, we also see a similar, mound-like structure at the heart of the temple with a special kind of position when we look at places like Machu Picchu, right? In the heart of the top level temples, you have this essentially platform-like space where something very precious was placed, and around it is some of the most advanced stone technology that exists in the site. As you can see here, you've got this spot, it's got these incredible views around it, it's central to the whole structure. You also notice that some of the stones around this area in Machu Picchu, Peru, and also going into stairwells up the mountains are crystalline, that the stones themselves have crystallized and become either more advanced, more amazing forms of stone or just more beautiful forms of stone. We have structures built around Machu Picchu that, again, show this incredibly advanced technology of stonework where the stone is literally merged right into the mountain, right into the fabric of the structure. And we can postulate that these sites for some ancient people before the Incas must have been major hub points for communications, for farming, for a variety of different kinds of things, and that they may have had something as powerful as an arc stone in the middle of these structures in order to leverage the energy of that system to do some kinds of things. And what those kinds of things are could be basically any needs that an ancient civilization might have had for electrical use, for stone resonance, for leveraging different kinds of things to enhance farming. There's a lot of potential ideas we can go on. But I think it gets clearer and clearer as we go forward here, the ways that they were using these technologies. And I'll explain exactly what those are. If we look between Peru and Bolivia, it's very fascinating because there's a bigger question here, which is why would the Incas terrace the entire Andean mountain ranges? When we go around there's hours and hours and hours drive as you travel from Peru down into Bolivia. And as you travel along these canyons, what you see is terracing, not just at the lower ends of the mountains, but going from the bottoms of the mountains all the way up to the top. And you can't really put yourself there, like, and say, like, would you plant cucumbers like 2,000 feet vertical feet up on the mountainside and climb up to harvest them? I mean, why would you do this level of terracing? Now, the archaeological story is, well, these terraces are very ancient. They must have, they must have been needing to feed, a very, very large couple million people, couple million Incas must have lived around there. But the amount of terracing that's here is at a scale that goes far, far beyond any of the postulations of the Incas. And the Incan terraces are pretty well developed. Like, we can see the rocks, we can see the way that the terraces were built. In this case, when we look at the Andean mountains, we see evidence of terracing that looks much, much older. It's ancient. It's been eroded heavily over a very long period of time. It is not just fresh terracing rocks, that are a couple thousand years old or 1,000 years old. So this looks like the kinds of terracing you would use as a breadbasket for an entire planet. And that leads us to a lot of inquiry about, well, why would they grow that much food, and how many different areas and cultures around the world were they connected to that would make them, grow that level of food? Now, once we get down to Bolivia, we get to one of the most famous sites there called Pumapunku. And when we look at the structure of the way that the stones were cut at Pumapunku, everybody points to these big famous H blocks. But I found one of the most simple blocks to be the most interesting. Look at the cut on this stone. Look at the laser sharp precision, the regularly spaced and drilled, obviously drilled holes in the stone. Now, that looks like an artifact you'd see from a modern form of technological construction, right? Drilling some holes into some stones, cutting something with a giant diamond saw to give us this nice smooth curve, right? And then you look at some of the other stones and the H blocks with these like crazy levels of depth. Every one of them is different. These were obviously not pressed inside of any kind of template structure. Then you've got these huge other pieces of stone, and they've got these areas where it looks like they used to be linked, perhaps with some kind of metal bars or an object that would link these stones together. And what you notice is that this site is decimated. I mean, it's just been destroyed completely. And the level of destruction that we see is crazy. It was as if the entire temple was completely blown apart into pieces and including the roof, what we think of as potentially the roof blocks, which each are 50 tons, sometimes plus, and that the entire structure just completely fell apart. Now, the archaeologists have brought pieces back and stacked them around and put them in random places because they have no idea how it used to look. But we again have this evidence of something blew up, something exploded and went very wrong. This is not a ruins that just fell apart over time. This is something that detonated. And when we look at the links between the stones and the kind of fits and these structures that look like they could connect stones together, again, we have this evidence of resonance capacitance, the ability for stone to vibrate and resonate electricity, piezoelectricity, resonate vibrational energy into each other would require these kinds of bindings that we see right here exactly on these structures on the ground. Now at Tiwanaku, we have some other very interesting things that point to advanced technology, from the perfectly round curves of pieces of stone that are just sitting there on the ground as a base of a pillar, to pieces of stone half buried that have perfectly beveled holes in them with beveled edges, as if they were designed to roll on part of a wheel or be part of a central axle of some kind. And again, it's not just that it's a round hole, it's the way the round hole is done that doesn't match our archaeological story about the Incas in the past, and does not match evidence in any way of a Bronze Age like culture chiseling these kinds of things out of a stone like this. Then, of course, you've got things like this gateway, which my students and I found to be extremely fascinating. When you cross through this portal, it literally feels like you're moving through some kind of energetic membrane. And it looks like it used to have some kinds of things installed into it. Perhaps this was a gate of some kind, and maybe there was a way they figured out how to connect some of these gates together. Again, that's a postulation, but as we go forward, it becomes a little bit less of a crazy one and starts to become a little bit more of a curiosity about the level of advancement and technology we're actually talking about for these cultures. So let's move on to Egypt, because in Egypt, we have a lot of these same kinds of building technologies that are present. One of my favorite things to point to are these rose granite pillars. Now, rose granite in itself is not that hard. It's not that hard to shave rose granite. It's not that hard to chisel it out. But these pillars are not just almost round, they're ridiculously perfectly round. And they go up, a good, I'd say 40, 50 feet. And as they go up, they're not just cylinders, they get smaller in diameter. So they taper down and then they flare back out at the top. And these are made from single pieces of rock. This is one stone in this perfect pillar. Now, we could do this, but it would take a turntable the size of a freight train and a perfectly calibrated diamond saw to be sawing the giant rose granite chunk, in order to get this level of roundness and perfection. And just so you can kind of get a sense of the roundness, I have a close-up here of a hole that's bored into an alabaster piece at another site. But I like to reference this because understanding how you create something that's that round doesn't seem like a big deal if you don't have any engineering knowledge at all. But if you're an engineer and you look at how do you actually do this to a piece of stone, it's astounding.